Governments keep building systems to punish dictators and terrorists, but those same systems keep starving the civilians they are supposed to protect. There are legal loopholes written specifically to prevent this from happening, and the data shows they fail, almost every time. The global food supply chain runs on the exact same financial system that economic sanctions are designed to cripple, and that creates an impossible contradiction. Because when you weaponize international banking, food and medicine end up as collateral damage. Between 1990 and 2009, the average number of active sanctions regimes per year sat at 250, and by the following decade, that number had nearly doubled to 482. The world sanctions more aggressively than ever before, and the people paying the price are not the regimes being targeted. The international community tried to fix this by creating something called humanitarian carve-outs, legal exemptions designed to let food, medicine, and aid flow freely into sanctioned countries. On paper, the design looks flawless. In practice, the system collapses at nearly every pressure point, and the evidence proves it. The origins of humanitarian carve-outs trace back to one of the darkest chapters in modern sanctions history. During the 1990s, a blanket embargo on Iraq created conditions so severe that children died from preventable diseases, medicine disappeared from pharmacies, and basic food became unaffordable for ordinary families. The fallout horrified the international community, and even the United Nations acknowledged that comprehensive embargoes were too destructive and fundamentally incompatible with international humanitarian law. That reckoning forced a strategic pivot. Rather than targeting entire economies, the UN shifted toward what they called smart or targeted sanctions, designed to isolate specific individuals, military programs, and designated entities while leaving civilian commerce intact. And with that shift came the first formal mechanisms for processing legitimate humanitarian goods. The United States codified this approach through the Trade Sanctions Reform and Export Enhancement Act of 2000, known as TSRA, which explicitly mandated the lifting of unilateral U.S. sanctions on commercial sales of food, agricultural commodities, and medical products to state sponsors of terrorism, a list that included Iran, Libya, North Korea, and Sudan at the time. And this is where the contradiction embedded itself into the system's foundation. Rather than allowing open trade, TSRA subjected every food and medicine export to rigorous licensing procedures administered by the Office of Foreign Assets Control, known as OFAC. The government granted the moral authority to export life-saving goods while simultaneously constructing an administrative maze that made exercising that right commercially perilous. That foundational tension would define more than 2 decades of humanitarian failure. The engine behind that failure carries a deceptively clinical name, de-risking, and the mechanics are brutally simple. International sanctions carry enormous penalties for any bank that violates them. Penalties that include multi-billion-dollar fines, revoked banking licenses, and institutional reputational destruction. When a compliance department evaluates a transaction headed for a sanctioned country, even when the cargo is food or medicine, the calculation nearly always tilts the same direction. Conducting enhanced due diligence, screening every party against denied entity lists, and managing the legal exposure costs more than the bank earns from clearing the transfer. The numbers confirm this pattern. Banks allocate between 2.9 and 8.7% of their total non-interest expenses to compliance functions. Annual compliance spending at large institutions with more than 20,000 employees routinely exceeds $200 million, and Deloitte estimates those operating costs have surged over 60% compared to pre-financial crisis levels. Given that arithmetic, the rational decision for a bank becomes obvious. Refuse the transaction, sever the banking relationship, walk away entirely. That is de-risking in operation. The scale of this withdrawal is staggering. 3 out of every 4 large international banks have reported cutting correspondent banking relationships, according to the World Bank. And the damage concentrates in the places least equipped to absorb it, smaller countries scattered across the Caribbean and Africa. Syria offers one of the starkest examples, where bank de-risking slashed the cash available to the nonprofit community by at least 35% at any given point, stretching fund availability gaps to 3 to 5 months beyond historical norms. What this means for people on the ground is spelled out in the survey data. Among humanitarian NGOs, 92% reported that sanctions and counterterrorism regulations disrupted their operations. 77% described carrying enormous new administrative loads, and 58% tracked direct increases in financial costs. The figure that captures the real damage is 42%. Nearly half of all surveyed NGOs were forced to postpone or cancel humanitarian programs entirely because the banking system would not process their payments. And the machinery that drives those rejections runs on something even more frustrating: automated screening algorithms that generate a flood of errors. Every cross-border payment passes through Sanctions screening software that compares transaction data against lists of designated entities. Between 5 and 10% of all cross-border payments trigger an automated sanctions alert, and of those flagged transactions, 90 to 95% turn out to be false positives, not actual matches. Fuzzy name matching technology, transliteration variations across alphabets like Arabic and Cyrillic, and simple coincidences where a legitimate person happens to share a name with someone on a sanctions list generate thousands of phantom hits every day. Clearing a single false positive alert consumes between 5 and 20 minutes of analyst time. A major bank processing upward of 200,000 transactions daily burns through thousands of hours on manual review. And while each alert sits in queue, legitimate food shipments and payroll transfers for aid workers remain frozen. The compliance technology market tells its own story. Transaction monitoring spending is projected to hit $43.2 billion by 2034, and artificial intelligence adoption across compliance departments has reached 78%. AI slashes individual review times from over 18 minutes down to roughly 35 seconds, which sounds like a breakthrough until you look closer. Tuning algorithms to capture more genuine threats simultaneously increases the raw volume of false positives. And because regulators punish missed sanctions violations far more severely than they punish false alarms, banks calibrate every system to err on the side of blocking, not clearing. Security wins over efficiency, without exception. All of this friction feeds directly into the cost of putting food on tables in sanctioned countries. During active sanctions regimes, real food prices in targeted developing nations climb an average of 1.24 percentage points above non-sanctioned baselines. In wealthy nations, a shift that small barely registers. But in low-income countries where families spend upward of 50% of their income buying food, that escalation tears through household budgets. The prevalence of undernourishment rises by 2.1 percentage points under sanctions, translating abstract financial policy into measurable physiological harm across millions of people. The chain of cause and effect runs through predictable channels. Sanctions choke agricultural trade, restrict access to inputs like fertilizers and machinery, and destroy trade finance instruments. Without standard letters of credit, importers turn to shadow lenders charging steep interest rates. Logistics costs balloon alongside the risk premiums. Moving a single metric ton of wheat from a destination port to a flour mill in Arab countries already costs an average of $40 and takes 78 days under normal conditions. And when sanctions force shipping firms and insurers to price in their exposure, and vessels reroute thousands of extra nautical miles, those baseline figures explode. The country-level data leaves no ambiguity. After nuclear-related sanctions hit Iran, consumer prices spiked 30% between 2012 and 2013, and food prices surged 64% between 2017 and 2019. During the comprehensive embargoes of the early 1990s, rice prices climbed 137%, and corn shot up 184%. Afghanistan's consumer price index reached an all-time high of 148.60 points after billions in central bank assets were frozen following the government's collapse in 2021, with inflation peaking at 13.7% before the economy cratered into deflationary collapse as liquidity simply disappeared. Faced with decades of these outcomes, the UN Security Council attempted the most ambitious institutional reform in the history of sanctions. On December 9, 2022, the Council adopted Resolution 2664, co-led by the United States and Ireland, passing with 14 votes in favor and only India abstaining. The resolution established a standardized, legally binding, standing humanitarian carve-out across all UN sanctions regimes, declaring that providing funds, goods, and services for humanitarian assistance did not violate asset freeze measures. December 2024 brought Resolution 2761, which extended this protection indefinitely to the ISIL and Al-Qaeda sanctions regime, covering aid flows reaching over 100 million people across Afghanistan, the Sahel, Syria, and Yemen. Measurable results followed. A study spanning 120 sanctioned countries from 2000 to 2023 documented that average aid delivery delays dropped from 22 days to 13 days after carve-outs took effect, and the under-5 mortality rate improved by approximately 8 to 10%, as vaccination coverage and malnutrition interventions accelerated. None of that fixed the deeper structural failure. A 2024 study measuring the resolution's actual impact found that half of surveyed financial institutions described themselves as only somewhat familiar with Resolution 2664, while 18.75% admitted they had never heard of it. Among institutions that did know about it, half reported only a medium-level change to their due diligence procedures. Banks continued relying far more heavily on OFAC's domestic general licenses than on the UN mandate, treating the resolution as background noise rather than operational guidance. The resolution also carries a built-in limitation that locks populations into permanent crisis. Exemptions apply strictly to immediate humanitarian relief, explicitly excluding the long-term reconstruction of hospitals, electrical grids, and water infrastructure. Communities in sanctioned countries receive emergency food, but never the functional systems required to sustain themselves, trapped in a cycle of perpetual triage with no path toward recovery. And then came the event that exposed every remaining illusion about how these protections actually function. On February 28, 2026, coordinated U.S. and Israeli forces launched Operation Epic Fury and Operation Roaring Lion, striking Iranian military infrastructure across the country. The assault killed Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei and produced over 700 reported casualties. Iran's response came immediately through Operation True Promise 4, which sent hundreds of ballistic missiles and drones into targets across 9 Middle Eastern countries, hitting military bases in Kuwait, data centers in the UAE, and energy facilities in Saudi Arabia. Within days, the Strait of Hormuz turned into a combat zone. That 21-mile-wide choke point carries approximately 20 to 21 million barrels of crude oil daily, accounting for roughly 20 to 25% of global seaborne oil trade, and one-third of the world's seaborne fertilizer shipments. Daily ship transits collapsed from an average of 129 in February to just 3 by March 3, 2026. A 97% crash that trapped over 170 container ships and 450,000 TEU of capacity inside the Gulf. What happened next rendered every legal exemption irrelevant. Between March 1st and March 4th, major maritime insurers, including Guard, Skuld, North Standard, the West of England, and the American Club, issued 72-hour notices of cancellation for war risk coverage in Gulf waters. Voyage-by-voyage premiums vaulted from the baseline rate of 0.025% of hull value to somewhere between 0.5 and 5%, representing a 1,000% increase at minimum. No OFAC license overrides the insurance market. No UN resolution compels an underwriter to cover a vessel sailing through an active war zone. When the premium exceeds any conceivable profit margin on humanitarian cargo, legal permission to move food becomes an abstraction with zero practical weight. Shipping lanes rerouted around the Cape of Good Hope, adding weeks to transit times and compounding costs at every stage. The World Food Program reported that operations like those in Sudan absorbed an additional 25 days of shipping time from these diversions, a 50% increase in supply chain duration. Brent crude climbed above $100 a barrel. Global fertilizer supplies dropped sharply enough to threaten agricultural yields worldwide, and the UN's emergency relief chief estimated the conflict burned through $1 billion of global economic value per day, all while the UN's $23 billion humanitarian appeal sat severely underfunded. The Security Council, the same body that had passed Resolution 2664 4 years earlier, could not act. Geopolitical divisions between the US, Israel, and Iran activated veto mechanisms, and the Council failed to mandate safe passage for humanitarian vessels through the strait. While those geopolitical gears locked in place, something equally destructive was growing inside the sanctioned countries themselves: the conflict economy. Formal banking channels severed from the global system leave a vacuum, and informal financial networks, underground hawala systems, and shadow currency markets rush in to fill it. Afghanistan absorbed approximately $1.8 billion in international humanitarian cash shipments over a single year, money that became the primary force keeping the local economy from total collapse. But because Western agencies could not transact through the sanctioned central bank, those funds flowed through opaque mechanisms that funneled wealth toward the same local power brokers the sanctions were designed to isolate. Yemen produced an even sharper illustration. A single domestic bank extracted $80 million in pure profit over just 8 months by manipulating the exchange rates applied to incoming humanitarian transfers. Armed groups, recognizing how completely international organizations depended on local cash liquidity, leaned on financial institutions to supply them with cheap, hard currency for military procurement. The end result turns the entire sanctions logic inside out. Rigid overcompliance by Western banks pushes billions of humanitarian dollars into unregulated, exploitable channels, which means the financial restrictions intended to starve armed groups of capital end up generating a reliable, easily taxable revenue stream for those exact same actors. 26 years of evidence, from 2000 through 2026, trace an unmistakable arc. The legal architecture of humanitarian exemptions grew more sophisticated with each passing year, reaching its highest expression in Resolution 2664, while the real-world capacity to deliver aid buckled under financial de-risking, insurance market dynamics, and outright warfare. Working solutions do exist within this landscape. The World Food Programme's Building Blocks project uses blockchain to track cash transfers and food distribution without routing through traditional banks, integrating more than 4.8 million families in Ukraine between 2022 and 2024, and generating savings exceeding $200 million in bank fees. The ePhyto system standardizes electronic phytosanitary certificates across 148 registered countries and processes 250,000 certificates per month. The Swiss humanitarian trade arrangement, for all its limitations, proved that a secure payment channel could function under extreme sanctions pressure. Each of these represents a partial answer to a problem that demands a structural overhaul. Legal permission, no matter how carefully drafted, will never substitute for the financial and physical infrastructure required to move food into crisis zones. That requires state-backed insurance pools dedicated to humanitarian cargo, mandatory safe harbor provisions that shield banks from penalties when they process verified aid transactions, and internationally protected transit corridors that no single nation holds the power to close. Until those mechanisms exist, economic sanctions will keep functioning as instruments of mass civilian deprivation, and the carefully constructed legal language of humanitarian exemptions will remain exactly what 26 years of evidence reveals it to be: an elegant and devastating geopolitical fiction.